All right, here we are on the third heading, global problems, something to that effect. We're on the second subheading, which is economic inequities and labor servitude. And so, if you haven't noticed, there is a bit of an unequal distribution of resources income uh, around the world. In some cases, that means we have millions of people who have, especially in the lesser developed countries, which struggle with things for like, food, water, shelter, so on and so forth. Um, and so this can be a huge problem, especially when it comes to things like malnutrition. Malnutrition obviously is a physical issue, but also can result in poor mental development and higher rates of infection. You'll notice where people tend to not be well nourished, they tend to get sick more. And so what ends up happening is we have these huge issues, both between countries and also within countries, which I'll talk about in a second. Um, Part of this division between rich and poor um, is a defining characteristic of complex societies. So in any city, you tend to have richer and poorer people. But what's happening here is much more than that. Part of it has to do with capitalism, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But essentially, one of the issues is that not all countries have the same resources. And so, if you have the correct resource, especially if other countries don't have it, then you're at a huge advantage. The other issue, a lot of it has to do with the economic legacy. You might have good natural resources, but if, oh, I don't know, a European country had colonized you and had set things up for that resource to leave your country, then that can be an issue. Also, as countries try to attract global corporations, they tend to, the selling point is low labor costs and usually less environmental regulations and lower taxes. So, a lesson in general to make sure you know is that just for everybody, you never want to be the low cost option. Like you have to be priced competitively. That's how capitalism works. But you never want to be the lowest price option or have clients that only want the cheapest thing because there will always be somebody who's willing to go cheaper than you. And that will cause you or the other people to have to, take deals which aren't advantageous to you. And so you always want to have, you never want to be the low cost option. So the few countries that kind of escaped that colonial issues are countries like those four tigers, which I mentioned previously. Um, so the other thing which your book really doesn't talk about a bit, but it should, is we see this within countries as well. Even countries like the United States, different parts of the country have different issues. There are parts of the United States, particularly where there's a lot of minorities in rural areas, which just don't have the same infrastructure that the rest of the country has, and that is a growing concern for more people. So it's not just inequities between countries; it's inequities within those countries. So the other thing that ends up happening is, although Saudi Arabia and Angola were the last to abolish slavery in the 1960s, there are still some really troubling labor practices which happen around the world. So, for instance, at the time of the writing of this book, the International Labor Organization from the UN thought that about more than 250 million children were living in inherently harmful business situations. So, child labor is especially pronounced in South and Southeast Asia, which you may or may not know. But the child labor can be things like an agriculture, domestic service, family business, but also, unfortunately, the sex trade. And so, what ends up happening is that some children are kind of born into basically bonded labor or essentially slavery. Other times, really poor people, especially in these lesser developed countries where there's still a high birth rate, they just can't take care of the kids, and so sometimes they will sell, especially women. They'll sell their younger siblings to make money for themselves, which is horrendous from their perspective. It's what they have to do. They feel like they have to do to survive, and um, so it's just a really sad situation. You're usually there in poor rural areas of different countries, sometimes even places like Russia and the Ukraine, which get either lured into with a promise of good paying jobs abroad, and they end up being horrible jobs, and or things like I said in sex trafficking they don't want to be in the midst of. And so that is one of the things that that's one of the issues that we're facing in the world right now is what do we do about the poorest of the poor? What do we do in these situations where people just don't seem to have any hope in the modern world? So with that, that's the second subheading.